In a minute, we'll have a panel here which will be talking about trust. Trust, which stands for transforming the relationship utilizing strategic technology between India and US. This panel will dive into the opportunities and challenges facing the US India technology partnership and how we can build a foundation of mutual trust to navigate today's rapidly shifting technological landscape. We are privileged to have with us Professor Joshua White to chair this session. He is the Professor of Practice of International Relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SCIUS, and a former Senior Director at the UN National Security Council. Joining him, we have two exceptional voices shaping the future of US-India tech diplomacy, Kriti Upadhyaya, founder of the IndUS Tech Council and a leader at C2C Advanced Systems, and Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director of Observer Research Foundation, America. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you. It's great to be here in my home institution. I didn't have to travel far, but it's terrific to have an India-focused event of this scale and depth, and I'm privileged to have been working with GKII on this and a lot of other events. I would also say that in a moment where there are many terrible things happening in this part of the world and in the world more broadly, it is reassuring to know that you can come to Johns Hopkins and get a chilled mango lassi right out there, the lobby. Don't go get one now if you haven't had one. Stay for this panel. But it is there, and it's delicious. Really delightful to have two friends and very smart interlocutors to talk about the technology dimension of the US-India relationship. This has come up in at least a couple of the last panels and discussions today, and there's so much material to mine, and we have not only new material, but we have new acronyms to unpack. This is one of the wonderful things about Washington. Every time there's a new administration, there's a concerted planning cell that emerges to rebrand new acronyms. So we'll be learning about that. And then we'll be trying to delve into some of the key technology areas and discuss what the future might look like in these areas. So I want to begin by asking Kriti if she could give us a bit of a lay of the land of this new US-India Trust Initiative. Where does it fall on the family tree of technology initiatives that the US and India have had over the years? And what kind of topics does it include in its current incarnation?
Thank you, Dr. White. Always a pleasure to be here. And I will answer your question, I promise. But first, let's just think about this, right? Like 20 years back, there was nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Today, when we look at India's maritime tech infrastructure, we have PATIs, we have Globemasters, PRIs and Globemasters both. India is the largest user outside of the United States. Sonobuoys, all the sonobuoys, all the sonars, everything is American. Just last week, even on the space maritime domain awareness front, India just started working with Hawkeye on the RF space. Again, a startup, all American. How did we get here? Well, a few years back, there was some alignment that started coming in. This was back in the days of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, when HTCG first started talking about that maybe there is something here, within US and India, within this tech partnership. They weren't very sure. There was alignment. It was very nebulous, but they went ahead with it. And they kept building, right? Various administrations, various governments, it didn't matter. We built on it. We came to DTTI. A lot of people will say it was a failure. I don't think it was a failure because it propelled us forward. Anything that propels you forward is not a failure. And in DTTI, it was still
sort of the Defense Technology Trade Initiative.
Yes, sorry, sorry.
I'm the acronym buster here.
Sorry. But in DTTI, we figured that now it wasn't just alignment. We're now thinking about pilot projects. We're thinking about how can we, it was still very government-led, but we were now starting to co-op companies. Fast forward, ISET, IndusX, same rationale. But now we're moving from alignment, from prototypes, from pilots, to actual platforms. And the realization that we're coming to is that let's do less. So let the government do less. In IndUS, we were like, we're the government, these are the areas, we're going to get you together, do the matchmaking, now you do you. With trust, now we're going a bit deeper. We're saying let's form the basis of this relationship. Let's focus on compute, let's focus on AI, let's focus on semicon, and let's just lay the foundations and then let companies do what companies do best. So 3 things really. What is trust about? Trust is about governments providing and enabling infrastructure, because that is the best that the governments can do. Secondly, it's about dual-use technology, because gone are the days that innovation is happening in labs, DRDO or DARPA labs. It's happening today in startups. Gone are the days when technology or operational efficiency is being shaped in SCIFs. It's being shaped in, I don't know, WeWork, boardrooms. So it's about making sure that technology is really flowing from the private sector, and government is absorbing it. And thirdly, and lastly, trust is about US and India doing what democracy is doing best. This is not the Russian technology model that we followed back with medicine, defense, and so on, which is top-down, G2G. I love the fact that G2G deals are coming down, right? I love that. It is about startups, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, all of these guys coming together and taking the US and India technology relationship forward. So I'll end this. What is trust? What is in the name? It's all the same. What trust really is much like startup founders, our governments coming together, iterating, pivoting, coming up with fancy acronyms for the same thing to really propel us forward on this relationship.
It's a great backstory. Dhruva, I wanted to ask if you could unpack for us a little bit, before we get into specific technology areas, some of the mutual logic of technology cooperation. Because some of it might seem natural. Well, these are partner countries. Of course, they're going to cooperate on technology. But what's in it for the United States, and what's in it for India, and where do they each see their best play here?
Right. First of all, thank you, Josh, and thanks to Johns Hopkins and to the organizers for this. It's a real privilege to be here. Kriti ran through a kind of the brief and quick history of U.S.-India tech collaboration, particularly on the defense side. I think a few things to keep in mind. I think as she mentioned, this was in some ways what we're seeing now is a sort of high-level engagement led by, in the Prime Minister's office in India, by National Security Council here. So it really is top-down. And then I think the second dimension she rightly pointed out is this is really private sector now. We're beyond the stage. For India, a big challenge really, just to sort of dial back a little bit, between the 1970s and 1990s in particular, was this idea that India was sort of behind this technological curtain. And getting access to, lowering the barriers for export control and things like that were ways from the U.S., which is one of the leading sources of innovation and technological innovation in the world, arguably the leading source of technological innovation. That was really the big goal of a number of initiatives, starting really in the 1990s, but extending until relatively recently. But I think we now, as she said, come into a new phase where we're moved away from kind of how do we lower the barriers to how do we actually push and incentivize collaboration, and this really will require the private sector. But what's the logic behind it? And I think that's a key question. I think for India, it's a bit more obvious. The US is a technological leader in many areas that India has prioritized, that it deems important both for national security and for economic growth and prosperity, and sometimes at the intersection of those areas. And this includes defense, space, digital technologies, telecom, biotech, AI, quantum computing, clean and green technologies, just to mention a few, automation, just to mention a few areas. But it's of course much broader than that. For the United States, I think there were two things, and I think the Biden administration had a particular logic to it, and it was really in the aftermath of. I mean, if you remember, the Biden administration came in during the height of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and the question of supply chain security really was top of mind for people like Jake Sullivan, Tarun Chhabra, people like that who at the White House who were leading some of the tech policy at OSTP and others. So I think supply chain security was really top of mind. How can we work with trusted partners to strengthen supply chains. And there were real concerns because of US-China competition about the over-concentration of supply chains in China and manufacturing generally. So supply chain security, decoupling, and the strategic logic were really what initially animated the Biden administration to, within a few months, really, it was quite quick of their coming in, upgrade the Quad, and again, within a year or two, launch ICET, but really push the agenda on the US-India tech partnership. The Trump administration, I think, has a slightly different set of priorities, not entirely mutually exclusive, and sometimes a bit more technological focus on a few specific technologies, and I know we'll get into that. But really, AI and data centers, the computing power that is needed is going to be vast. Obviously, a lot of it will be here, but they understand that having it in places like India will really help bring down the costs of computing. Nuclear, civil nuclear is a second area. Critical minerals supply chains, another. So these are top of mind for the Trump administration. Undersea cables, I would say those are kind of four areas that really come to mind, and were all mentioned in the trust sort of the statement that kind of rebranded trust. So again, not entirely moving away, but I think a bit more focused on a few of these areas. We're going to see less of an emphasis on clean and green energy under Trump administration, not surprisingly. But that I think explains the logic a little bit.
That's helpful, and I want to push you on one piece of this, which is if you're India and you are obviously in a position where you want to acquire advanced technologies, this makes sense. But I want to push you on the United States logic a little bit. On many of these key technology areas, the United States is at or near the technology frontier. Right? And in most of these areas, India is behind the technology frontier, sometimes a little bit, sometimes considerably. Right? So if you're the United States, explain a little more the driver of not just having a technology partnership, but having, you look at the Biden administration, you had the National Security Advisor spending an extraordinary amount of time with this partnership. What is the short-term, long-term logic that you think was in play, and how much will that logic carry over into the present moment, this administration and beyond?
I mean, I think actually you can put it into one word, which is scale, right? I mean, if you're going to do anything at scale, you have to involve India. Actually, Kurt Campbell and Russ Doshi wrote something recently in Foreign Affairs, which basically makes that case that if the U.S. can do, the U.S. can compete on its own in various frontier technologies and do it well. But if you're taking on China, which has 4 times your population, and you're competing there, you need that scale, and that's only going to come with, yes, you can add Europe, you can add Japan, Korea, other U.S. Trusted allies, Australia. But to really work at scale, and I'd say related to that cost, right? And I've spoken to, we all know people in various companies, and they say, look, I want to compete globally, and I have the best product, but the only way I can reduce my manufacturing costs is to manufacture some parts of it in India, and again at scale. So I'd say it's really about scale and related to that cost.
Which is a great segue to the questions about AI broadly, because a lot of the AI game is a scale game, right? Particularly with distributed requirements for computational power for compute, and then the other piece of this, big piece of this, is in thinking about AI models. The AI dimension of the technology cooperation received a lot of prominence in the recent statement about this trust initiative. Where do you see the low-hanging fruit or the potential for actual collaboration in both of these, in compute and then in models where the U.S. and China really have I think significant advantages? And Kriti, you're welcome to reply as well in any order you guys prefer.
I'll just add to what Dhruva added. I think another benefit for the U.S. is just getting into some of these other markets, right? Because both from a cost perspective, but also from a technology sensitivity perspective, and I'll give you an example, right? There are already US stuff is so expensive, especially on the tech piece. If you do it in India, it's cheaper, even for the US and in India, but also this is more relevant in third markets, right, where you really want to penetrate. Secondly, there are areas like where technology is really controlled. You can work with India to not only have cheaper versions, but also non-controlled versions. There are companies like Anavia who are doing that. So for example, they have a heli drone, which is ITAR, but then they also supply a non-ITAR one to Egypt. And those sort of things can be made in places like India. On AI, I think AI is, India is going to be the training ground for AI, for making those models stronger. And this is across the board, right? Talking about LLMs, where you're going to get more diverse languages, talking about terrains, field data, right? India's the best at high altitude warfare. If we're talking, it's all about autonomy today, right? San Francisco, DC, it's all about autonomous systems. If US wants to learn, train autonomous systems, those field data on high altitude is only going to come from India. So when it comes to data training, India is going to be so important. Now, 3 areas, and I'm glad Dhruva mentioned compute, and that's why the supercomputers that US gave to India were so critical. Compute power is going to be very, very critical. Data centers are going to be critical. I see a lot of Indian companies, without taking names, including big conglomerates, are investing in the US on data centers. I think there is a need for US and India to think about joint data centers, secure data centers. Secondly, energy. And that's why I was so happy when just last time when Prime Minister Modi was here, we started talking about the small nuclear reactors and so on, because that energy, reliable, cheap energy is going to be very critical for AI. And then finally, I think this is something that is a little bit boring, so we don't give it as much thought. We don't want to work on it. But it is so critical. We've had dialogues and so on, but what we really need to work on is ethics and morality, deciding the rules of the game. Because we want to do it before people who don't think like us start doing that. So I think AI is overall a huge opportunity for India, for US and India cooperation, but there are 2 things that I'm fearful about. One is that, and we saw a little bit of this happening when the whole ChatGPT and India AI, I'm not sure what it's called, and DeepSeek, all of this started happening. When we're thinking about AI, especially amongst friends, we shouldn't be in an AI race. We shouldn't think about who is going to build faster. We should think who is going to build, how can we build together, how can we build sustainably, how can we build for the future, and how can we build in an ethical manner. So I think that's one thing that we don't want to get into an AI race on stupid things. Secondly, I think the fearful part is that are we really thinking about those rules of the games for AI, just for industry at large, but also perhaps even more so in some of these wondrous areas like defense and autonomy.
Yeah, I would say on AI, just again, the U.S. has a incredible AI ecosystem. It's a very exciting time. It's a very exciting field. But there's certain ingredients that are needed, and everyone focuses on a couple, and there are a couple more that I think now people are thinking about a bit more. One is obviously the hardware side, which is where India is perhaps lacking the most, and now you've seen some very big investments made just in the past few years start to come online on the hardware side. The second is the data that Kriti spoke about, which is vast amounts of data in India. So the U.S. also has that. But I think the 2 other dimensions. One is talent, right? And at every level, you need that talent, and a lot of it is coming from India. There's a great study done by the Carnegie Endowment a few years ago, so it's a bit dated already, on where some of the top AI talent was coming from. And India is, for the really top tier, it is the 2nd largest source of that. It's certainly easily in the top 3 with the US and China. So a lot of, there is going to be a kind of competition for that talent. And I'd say the 4th is actually kind of some of the natural resources that need to be underestimated, I think. Land, energy, water, the critical minerals. And so again, everyone's now sort of realizing estimating what this will cost if you're going to increase particularly the hardware side. So that's why a country like Singapore or Taiwan will have its limitations, right? They can have some of the best talent, but they're still going to be constrained. So I think India brings some bits of all of that to the table, but I would stress not the data correctly, and it'll be a big source of user data, but also the talent piece I think is worth pointing out.
And I want to follow up and ask about the semiconductor dimension of this, because India announced not long ago a semiconductor mission, a lot of semiconductor ambitions, and I mean, let's be honest, there were and are a lot of skeptics, and I think some of the things that we all hear from the skeptics are that, look, this is a prestige play more than a sort of well thought through effort at building into a comparative advantage. India doesn't have existing sort of supporting ecosystem for this sort of precision manufacturing. And India wants to start at sort of logic chips rather than things that would allow it to move up the sort of semiconductor value chain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What have you seen since the time that India launched this effort that makes you optimistic, and what have you seen that makes you think, well, this could happen, but this could be a long slog?
Yeah, I think a lot of those things that people hear, I think of people who haven't really looked at that in any detail, and I'll tell you why I'm mostly optimistic about it. I think it's a very serious priority, and it's not just about prestige. If even we project forward like business as usual approaches, India is going to be importing more in semiconductors than it is in oil, right? So it's going to be hugely expensive. So at some level, given the scale of the market, it will have to start manufacturing more, semiconductors at home. Just given the scale. So this idea that it's just like I've had this discussion even in India. They're like, we're still providing basic services. Semiconductors. They think of it as this expensive thing, but it's so integral to people's day-to-day lives. Everyone has a mobile handset in their pocket, right? They depend upon that for almost every aspect of their life. So semiconductors are going to be integral for any kind of society going forward, and the fact that India is unable to manufacture it is going to, if it continues, would be a major hindrance. Second, there's been enormous financial outlay. I've just run some numbers, and this is already about a year old. That India spent almost $50 billion on tech broadly in terms of public funding. We're talking. This is like Chips and Science Act level. If you think of it proportionate to the Indian economy, this is massive, right? And this is funding that's already been spent. A big chunk of that, not all of it, has gone towards the semiconductor mission through a variety of different schemes. Now, where is India going with this? In the past, there have been at least 2 attempts at developing a semiconductor infrastructure, one in the 1980s, one in the early 2000s, that didn't really go anywhere. And the best India could do was a sort of 180 nanometer fab in Chandigarh, which had its own problems. So that's kind of where India was before the semiconductor mission started. In the intervening period, what we have seen is sort of at 3 levels, and this is like in some ways the full supply chain. Indian companies are already pretty well integrated on the design side, and pretty much every semiconductor company has some exposure to using Indian talent, from NVIDIA to you name them, to different degrees, obviously. So I think on that front, there have been some major investments, including with the help of the U.S. So Lam, for example, has invested in training 60,000 people in India in the semiconductor field. So that's been one major investment announced in 2023. Applied Materials has also put up an engineering center there. The second is the fab, which is the hardest part. Some people thought of it as just a cherry on the top, but it's actually important. And there has been now investment in the necessary infrastructure for fabs in Gujarat at scale. So the idea is to create a cluster, a hub, because we found at places that's what works. And creating the infrastructure for what actually 4 times what is the current capacity, 4 or 5 times. This includes land, water, electricity, dedicated electricity, transport. So the key. There's one major fab being constructed now. It is a Taiwanese company, PSMC, in collaboration with the Tatas. But the scope now for much more. The third bit, which is again an easier entry point, is the advanced testing and packaging side. And they're both in Gujarat, where there are at least 2 facilities coming up, another one in Assam, there might be one in UP as well. There are a number of areas where that is coming up. So Micron and Tata, for example, have a joint venture in that space in Gujarat. So at every level, you're seeing now the investments being made. This is the start. This is not the end. But this is going to cut down the fab is going to produce 28 nanometer chips. So it's bringing it down. We're bringing it down from 180 to 28 nanometer. We're not yet. We're not talking 3 nanometer. What China and Taiwan are doing, but even the U.S. is struggling with that. As we've seen some success on the U.S. side. But this is the pathway forward. But these serious investments have already been made. They've already found buyers for it. So you know, this is serious. This is something. The question is, can this be the start of something, or for a variety of reasons, this will really require private investment to pick up to take this further.
Kriti, I want to ask you about some defense topics, which could be a hours-long discussion. But there are many things that India wants to make for itself, right? It has many defense needs. We've seen that over the last few days. But if you could help us think about some of the things that India could make that others might want, where there would be a U.S.-India nexus to the production or to developing things together. Where do we stand in that story of doing things together, or doing things, India producing, designing things that could have a market here, either as part of larger systems or buying off the shelf?
Love to answer that question. I think there's so much. So let's start with, I'll touch on both software and military on the manufacturing side. The whole defense military industrial complex has really changed a lot in the past decade or so. And one of the major shifts that has happened has really helped India. Unfortunately, India hasn't necessarily capitalized on it as much. So one major shift is that earlier, defense was mostly hardware. Today, you'd have like 60-70% hardware, rest was software. Today, it's been flipped, right? The hardware, the COTS are not as critical or as big as part of the whole suite of offering as the software is. And our software is something that India is really good at, and US and India together are really good at, because even if you think in terms of just the talent piece that Dhruva was mentioning, US itself, I think, has around 8,000, China has about 8,000 engineers. US and India together have like about, over 15,000 engineers, right? So the software part is really where I think there's a lot that US and India can do, and that's, I'll give you an example, a personal example from this. I think this is something where we can really replicate even the IT and pharma model in defense services. So, and this is also an area where, India gets technology and Indian firms really learn a lot. Our company, C2CI, we provide OSI maritime software services. What it does is it lowers their costs. It gives us an ability to add to that, NATO infrastructure. And in the process, our engineers, their learning curve has been absolutely phenomenal. Software services is a great area where US and India, I think, can work together. On the military side, too, if you're thinking about, on the manufacturing side, too, I think there are various areas within manufacturing, composites and so on, smelting, within the defense infrastructure, where India is doing a lot of work. Platforms, I think, in terms of platforms, India's still getting there, but I think software services, integration, that's really where I would start working right now. But platforms, I think, will still take some time.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Just a couple of things. I mean, I think all correct. I think the software component and the value add is going to be higher going forward. But I think people, when you look at the macro picture of US-India defense cooperation, I think people miss the component manufacturing now that's taking place in India, that it's quite significant. And the other thing is what I call MRO possibilities. So for maintenance, repair and overhaul. I always forget the R. But basically, servicing of military equipment, we're now seeing more American vendors looking to service in India for a variety of reasons. It makes sense from a cost perspective. So that's actually the primary reason, not a strategic play. But also the location, right? So it's cheaper sometimes for, say, U.S. or allied forces there in the Indo-Pacific to go to India rather than fly it back to the U.S. So I think these are some areas where we're going to see the defense relationship move in some more interesting ways.
I'll just add to...
Sorry, one more thing I failed to mention on the semiconductor side. There was a recent agreement between General Atomics and a company called Third Eye Technologies in India. And what's interesting about it is it's a deal to manufacture military-grade chips for the U.S. military. So I mean, just to combine sort of the defense line that we were talking about and the semiconductors line, we're moving some really interesting and exciting areas that were just unthinkable even 10 years ago.
I'll just add to the
Before you do, we're going to take a couple questions in our last few minutes. If you have a question, go to one of those microphones if they're up there, and we'll have time for a couple of short questions that should be questions, not statements. Please.
No, I was just adding to Dhruva's point that there is a lot of components going out of India, and many people will be surprised right now. India's largest defense export is actually to the United States. All of these are small components, COTS, and supply chain parts.
Any questions from the audience? If not, I, as the moderator, of course, have a default question. There's one right here. You can stand, speak clearly. I'll repeat your question for everyone who can't hear, because it will be a short, focused question. I know.
Yes, I can promise you that. Given that India has always been, in terms of the value chain, at the lower end, because we've heard again about the cost being low and the volumes being there. The question is there a roadmap between the United States and India to take in particularly the very strategic fields of AI and quantum and others, where the cutting edge is there with the United States, but India's way behind. But in terms of the intelligence, where does the roadmap take? Does it go to some level of parity in terms of value add, or does India always remain as a sort of complementary low-end partner?
So there's a question about the roadmap in advanced technologies for sort of the comparative contribution of the United States and India if there's to be actual partnership.
There isn't a single roadmap, and I'll tell you why. It's because the U.S. and India don't have a single technology strategy. I mean, forget about the other country. That's not how the U.S. or India functions. I think what we've seen with ISET and now Trust is a clear listing of what are the priority areas where both sides identify complementarity. So the closest thing I would point you to for a roadmap is the last few ISET and Trust under the new administration or Trust statement. But what does it look like? I would say, again, it really depends also on the technology. The most mature progress or the most advanced progress has been made on semiconductors, 5G, 6G, defense, space, and a little bit on biotech. And in each of these areas, both sides have identified this is what we can add value to, this is what we want, and this is what we want, and we have some complementarity. So, for example, on the semiconductor piece that I was talking about, the US companies that came in were because they had certain comparative advantages, and India needed that, and they were able to work out. But there are other areas where there isn't, on fabs. Both the US and India are now struggling to sort of reach at different stages of development, but they're both trying to court TSMC at the same time. So that's not an area where there are those natural complementarities. Space is another good example, I think, where there some very good natural complementarities that have been identified. Actually, it's going to be exciting. Two things are going to happen in the next few months on the space front. One is we'll have the first manned Indian manned space, an Indian going up into space for the first time in 40 years, for the first time on a U.S. U.S. spacecraft, a U.S. rocket. And the training has been in the U.S. It's been NASA training under the Artemis program. A second thing that's going to happen, I think, in June of this year is you'll have the most expensive Earth observation satellite ever launched by the U.S. and India jointly, ISRO and NASA. So again, I would hesitate to say it's always that India is low end and the U.S. is at the cutting edge, but I think they've both been able to identify in certain key technologies, some more than others, where there are those natural complementarities to pursue both their agenda forward. I would lastly just say a few areas where that hasn't happened yet. I think AI is one area that hasn't happened because again, the U.S. doesn't really have an AI policy. India doesn't. It's been a bit more difficult. The applications are so vast that it's not been. Quantum is also very difficult. There've been two initiatives, quantum U.S.-India quantum initiatives, but the fact is a lot of the technology is not yet that commercially viable. So I would say again, those are the success cases. I would say AI, quantum. From India's point of view, one area which hasn't been explored sufficiently is DPI. Digital public infrastructure. India is very keen on internationalizing it more. For the U.S. and most U.S. companies, they don't really yet appreciate the value add of it. So I would say, again, there's some areas where it hasn't worked out as well.
May I add, I don't think there needs to be a absolute complementarity every time, right? So what we're doing, for example, in the defense space is we're focusing on maritime domain awareness and high altitude warfare. Now, what India brings to the table there is operational efficiency. So US can bring the tech, India can still bring its strengths, which don't necessarily have to be in the tech space, right? US generals are up thinking about A280 systems, how to fight them. Indians know them, fight them every day, and those systems were built to be, used against India. So I think, it's an equal relationship. Doesn't have to be that only just a, technology complementarity. We're doing a lot of work, and we're bringing our strengths in different ways.
I think one of the broader themes, Kriti, that you mentioned that's relevant to this question as we wrap here is that there are specific collaborations in specific areas. There are ambitions together in specific areas. But Kriti, you talked about norms. And I think one of the things that is behind both what the Biden team did and what the Trump team is doing is trying to enmesh both countries into similar technology ecosystems, similar ways of approaching technologies, similar kinds of collaboration, right? And that's more relevant in some areas than others. On autonomous weapons, the U.S. doesn't even really know what it thinks, right? These are conversations that are very early. But in other areas, on 5G and on other questions, the U.S. does have a defined view, and coming to convergence about the norms, about the standards on a lot of digital technologies, this is becoming very significant to see U.S.-India convergence on this. And so I think both of you highlighted this in some ways in your own remarks on sectors and on ambitions. We are out of time, which is good only because there are so many other great topics to address. So if you would please join me in thanking my terrific panelists here.